Hey everybody, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about the day the star forts fell, because the more you look into these star forts, the star cities, the fortified cities, it's at least clear to me anyway that there was a point in time where something really bad happened and it affected a lot of these sites. So we're going to take a look at some of these fortifications. And Europe is known for a lot of its really impressive star cities, these marvels of the Renaissance. And this one is in France, and this is a fairly famous one, Palma Nova, which is in Italy. This is just another shot of it. I believe that there has been this destruction that's been covered up by the people writing our history. And when you look at some of these fortified cities, these walled cities, this is one in the Netherlands, Groningen. And when you look at some of the archaeology in, for instance, the Central Market, they find these buried features that appear to be from the 1600s or so, but they're 3 to 4 feet below grade. And what gets built on top are these Greco-Roman styled architecture, the Neoclassical architecture. And this happens a lot. And I want to look at Brussels, which is in Belgium. And I think this is another one of these walled cities, these fortified cities that felt the brunt of this unknown event that is not in our history. And this is a painting from 1665, and it is 30 years before the bombardment of Brussels, because when you look at the history of Brussels, one of the most destructive, if not the most destructive event occurred in 1695, or so we are told. And a lot of the city of Brussels was reduced to ashes, and we're told it was under orders of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, in 1695, and these French troops bombed the city basically. And what I'm thinking is that this is a cover story to account for this unknown event. And these are just some images of ruins of Brussels after the bombardment. And there is archaeology that has been done in Brussels that does indicate there is this buried level. So it's not a secret. It's just they're attributing all of this damage to this French force in 1695. But I think that this destructive event happened earlier than that. But we're told that the city wasn't even taken, actually. It was just subject to this intense and destructive bombardment, 5,000 bombs, 4,000 cannonballs, and then they left. And I think the narrative says that the city burned for 3 days, but miraculously, 5 years after the disaster, Brussels was almost entirely rebuilt, more beautiful than before the fire. The reconstruction was of an exceptional speed. So 5 years after largely being reduced to ashes, the city's rebuilt. And why that's impressive is because, just according to some of the statistics you can find, the bombardment of Brussels, in which more than 4,000 buildings were destroyed, including the entire city center. So thousands and thousands of buildings all gets rebuilt in record time. And again, they're attributing all this to the late 1690s. So by 1700, it's largely rebuilt. I think that this destruction and also the rebuild happened a point earlier than this. I'm not sure how much earlier, but what also happens after this destruction that we can find in Russia, we can find it all throughout Europe and the Americas. After this destruction, you have the rise of all this neoclassical architecture, the Greco-Roman styled architecture, and this is the case with Brussels as well. A lot of this architecture comes in, and as mentioned, you can find it in Moscow, another one of these fortified cities. Here we're told Catherine the Great ordered a portion of this city to be demolished, and you can find it buried below the present grade. And then what comes in after, you get the neoclassical architecture. So I think Brussels is a really good example of this same pattern, and this is the city center where most of the damage they're saying occurred. And number 3 represents the royal palace at the time, the Palace of Coudenberg. Now, what we're told is that during the fire that lasted several days, people who survived managed to get to this royal palace to find safety, and this palace went on to survive the ordeal. Now, what's interesting to me is that here's that central square. This is the area, And I just drew a measure here to roughly where the palace of Coudenberg was, where people sought safety, and it's less than a half a mile away. So it's not that far, but we're told it survived this bombardment. Well, when you look at, what happened to this palace, it survived until 1731, where a major fire destroyed most of the palace and it was left in ruins for 40 years. Basically, the present grade, you can find a buried level, including a street that's buried, and basically the exact same phenomenon that has happened to this palace happened to most of the city. So I think that the narratives they're giving us are false. I think all this damage happened at one time, and what gets built on top of the palace, just like the rest of Brussels, is this neoclassical architecture. So it just seems fairly evident at this point. And during the reconstruction on one of the buildings in the central square, they've placed at the top of this building a phoenix rising from the ashes. I think that's about all I wanted to hit on with regards to this. It's just different narratives that have been, in my opinion, crafted to hide this destruction from us. Now, speaking of lost colonies and these star forts, there was a botched attempt to colonize Central America by the Scottish, the colony that bankrupted a country. In the late 1690s, once again, there was an attempt to establish a colony by the Scottish, referred to as New Caledonia, and a fort was set up, and 2,000 people from Scotland made the voyage in a couple of different voyages, and most of them passed away, we're told. A lot of ships were lost, and it virtually bankrupted the country. I think a quarter of the wealth was tied up in this venture, and there is speculation that after this massive failure, it may have likely motivated the Articles of Union between Scotland and England in 1707. So this was a major step back for Scotland, and my thinking is this event caused this failure, and it happened earlier than the 1690s. That's my view on that. And there has been excavations that have unearthed part of this fortification at this fort, Fort St. Andrews. This colony was built in 1698 and abandoned in 1700, and you had roughly 2,000 people that arrived here, but they couldn't make it work. So again, I think this site is much older, but they do find a lot of the usual artifacts, the pottery, the clay pipes, the blue and white ceramics, and I just see this all over. And some of the ships, they found one of these ships buried in the bay called the Olive Branch, and it was found covered in mud at the bottom of Caledonia Bay. And I think it actually caught fire as well before it sank. So again, I just think a lot of this stuff is older. And in relation to where this failed colony was, you have Port Royal, Jamaica, speaking of the 1690s, which sank to the bottom of the Caribbean. This was attributed to an earthquake that destroys that Jamaican town in 1692, and there's been a lot written about this, and a lot of artifacts. Divers have gone down, and they find a lot of the similar artifacts. And I think maybe, just maybe, that the same event that I'm talking about that affected also, I think, this colony, maybe it affected Port Royal as well. So I think that's about all I got for you for today. I just wanted to kind of hit on a few of those things, and I do want to give a big shout out to my channel members. Thank you for all your help and support, as well as my patrons. Really appreciate all that you do. So thank you very much. So with that being said, until next time, take care.